Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of Environmental History Worth Reading. We are here at the beginning of winter with a roundup of what's best on the internet for environmental history. My name's Sean Courage. I'm an editor here at niche-canada.org, and I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica DeWitt, and I'm the social media editor for Niche.
An interesting set of picks from November 2017, Jessica, starting with one over here at Open Rivers, Rethinking Water, Place, and Community. Listening to a River. This is about sound history and environmental history.
Yes, sound history is something that I've become increasingly more interested in. Unexpectedly starting to focus on it in part of my dissertation. So in this post, Christopher Caskey is looking at, well, he starts off with Peter Coates's article and argument about how we need more sound history in environmental history. And Caskey argues that water is particularly tied to our oral experiences, and that he goes even further to say that sound for river histories is really, really important and pertinent. And he looks at the kinds of sources that are available or that have been used. Most commonly, people have used music and verse to look at the ways that people interpret the sounds of rivers. And less so, people have been looking at recordings of rivers. And I'm guessing that's less so because there aren't that many out there, particularly if you go way back in the past. So it's kind of looking at the ways that we can find more sources for this. And then he does a pretty good historiographical treatment of some river histories that have already been written, and looking at the ways that they have intertwined sound history, and basically saying there's so much more room for improvement and for more dedication to this topic. So yeah, just something that I've been really hyper aware of lately is sound history, so I thought this article was very interesting.
This one looks great, and this is an excellent publication, too, that viewers should check out.
Yeah.
Your second pick is a guest post over on The Disorder of Things, a blog here, and this is sort of part of Philip Conway, a PhD candidate's dissertation on the origins of the idea of the environment.
Yeah, so how he describes it, this thesis is partially environmental history, it's partially history of science, and he's talking about how his thesis basically argues that the environment, the term environment, kind of evolved out of Newtonian physics and evolutionary biology, and is very connected to Euro-American circles. But he's acknowledging that this conclusion is problematic. Firstly, he talks about how environmental and climatic thinking, particularly in the early years, was closely related to racial sciences, how ecological awareness as a concept is inherently colonial, and also how there's really no way of, not no way, but it's more difficult to know how much input and how much Europeans learn from indigenous people when it comes to the environment. And this is a very long post, so that's kind of like the first part. The second part is looking at the ecological Indian myth and history, the book that came out in 1999, and kind of connecting it to these problems and settler colonialism, etc., and looking at some indigenous reactions to that book. And then he goes into, I think, part of his thesis and looking at the environment and the history of how that term came into being. And he kind of ends the piece by saying, I've presented a lot of loose ends, just saying, inviting other people to start contributing to filling out this portion of history and this knowledge. So I thought it was interesting.
It sounds like an interesting dissertation, too, and there's a link at the top of the article to Philip's blog, where I'm sure you can find more on his work. The third pick this month takes a look at mountaintop removal mining over at Yale Environment 360.
Yeah, so mountaintop removal mining is just starting to be, I think, a topic that environmental historians can look at because it came into being in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the 1990s that it really went full force. And I actually didn't know this, was that after the Clean Air Act was put into place, that's what actually spurred this mountaintop removal because
Mm.
they wanted to mine coal that was lower in sulfur, which is apparently the coal that you get from mountaintop removal. So it's like environmental degradation came out of an environmental act. Um, but basically, this is an interview with Michael Hendricks, and he's researching the long-term effects that this type of mining has on the communities surrounding these mines. And I guess that most research has been done only on miners, but not the people who aren't actually working in the mine.
Mm.
Um, and what he's finding is that there are much higher levels of mortality and illness. 12,000, oh, not 12,000, 1,000, 1,200
Mm.
excessive deaths per year in mountaintop removal towns. Um, and he discusses, there's birth defects, low birth weights, talks about some of the health issues that they have. And another interesting thing is that there's a lot of prejudice against people who live in the Appalachian region.
Mm.
So people kind of push this higher mortality rate onto things like poverty and obesity and smoking, and don't look at the fact that a lot of this is due to the environment that they're living in.
Right.
Um, so I just thought it was a interesting piece to look at, and something that's contemporarily relevant, but also reaching back into history. So.
Now you look out west in your third pick with an article that looks at the ways in which gender has influenced representations of the West.
hmm Yes, this is something that I never really thought about, surprisingly. That the American West and the Canadian West myth was written by men. It's a masculine theory that revolves around rugged individualism, and the wilderness is something that needs to be conquered or tamed. So this just looks at that and questions what would happen and what will happen when women start writing more and more of the literature that surrounds the West, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. So I think this is something that environmental historians should think about. And I guess a lot of literature is being written by women now. And the author of this article asks, like, how will our collective vision of the West shift as more and more women write about it? And then she interviews two women writers who are writing about the West now. And
Mm.
they talk about how the man versus nature competition is no longer, when women write about the West is not a main feature, that there isn't really a winner. And they also claim that women are less sentimental about
Mm.
wilderness. Um, so just a lot of interesting things to think about, and not necessarily specifically environmental history related, but I think does color our field and something that we should think about.
Yeah, this is a great pick. It makes me think of the writing of Pearl Ann Reichwin and Karen Rutledge on mountaineering,
Yes.
and representations of wilderness via mountaineering groups that had men and women.
hmm
Excellent pick. And last but not least is a video. This is a TEDx Jacksonville video on rain.
Yes, this is a TED Talk by Cynthia Barnett, who wrote, I think it came out last year, Rain, A Natural and Cultural History. Um, and I just liked it because you don't see a lot of historians, let alone environmental historians, doing TED Talks, so
Mm.
that's nice. And it's a great example of how to bring environmental history to a public audience. And also, she has a political message. Whether or not you agree with it, it's still an example of how to use what we're doing in this field to support contemporary arguments. And her main argument is that nature and the increase in rain, or what Al Gore refers to as rain bombs, um, as are due to climate change. But she argues that it's not this rain or nature that we as people need to fear. Rather, we need to fear human inaction and action when in regards to the environment. And she goes through examples of through time. She tries to demonstrate that rain has always shaped humanity, and people have always tried to control the rain. So she goes quickly through some examples of that, and wraps up by going over our argument again. So quick 15-minute talk. All TED Talks are really quick, but a good example of how to talk to a public audience, I think.
Absolutely. Well, we end off this 2017 talking about rain, but I have a sneaking suspicion next month we may be talking about fire. Jessica, an excellent set of picks from January all the way through December. And I encourage viewers to go back and take a look at our past videos and take a look at all of Jessica's list each month that show up here at niche-canada.org. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Sean.